Well, thank you very much. Really appreciate the invitation from GIIGNL to speak with you today, and thank you to Cheniere for hosting this event. Thanks also to Jason for this morning introducing the topic of Paris. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the implications that I see for the LNG industry in general. I think that before I take you through some presentational materials, I want you to have two thoughts in your mind as I go through. One is that there will be a lot of uneven implementation of policy commitments going forward. That will lead to profound uncertainties affecting liquefied natural gas demand in general. That's a world where the infrastructure, the power plants and the liquefied natural gas terminals, all the way back to the liquefied natural gas production facilities, will be very important, but the actual level of molecules needed by the market will be very, very hard to predict. And it's a different world than the world I think that we were used to, say, for the first 30 or 35 or 40 years of the industry. Very briefly, COP21, Conference of the Parties, as part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris meetings were the 21st meeting of the Conference of the Parties. The Paris Agreement is very significant, but it is, as Jason mentioned, an agreement that is primarily voluntary. It's based around the national plans of the parties to the agreement. It's designed intentionally to have countries submit stretch targets, if you will, to strive to meet those targets and to come back on a regular basis and update their plans, update their achievements, but without any punitive mechanisms to punish countries for failing to meet those targets. That is a very important aspect, and it will lead to, as I said, looked at globally, to an uneven degree of, let's say, follow through on these commitments. When we talk about countries submitting low carbon development plans that translate into, here's a business as usual path, here's what we will do, therefore there's a large amount of carbon taken out of our future emissions path. The World Bank works with clients on tools like marginal abatement cost curves, MAC curves. This would be very familiar to Mr. Brishkani from McKinsey, because McKinsey was an early pioneer of these. I want to note their contribution. The way to look at a MAC curve is to understand that the left-hand side is things that countries can do now that make economic sense with no value assigned to the carbon. Things on the right-hand side are things that are not exactly commercial, and they would require a carbon tax or some other form of policy support to get them done. Now, the carbon cost is the vertical line, and you'll see that things that make sense today can be done at a negative price of carbon. Things that don't make sense would cost something. Where we see LNG, along the horizontal line, that is the volume of carbon reduction that we could achieve. In this case, the LNG component is a lot of carbon, but it would cost Vietnam, absent any carbon taxation, absent any other form of policy support or grants from the international market. That's essentially switching some coal plants over to LNG it would cost Vietnamese consumers money today to do that. Is Paris enough? This is the International Energy Agency view that we have in Paris aggregated commitments, which are great. They're a good place to start. More will be needed to achieve the goal that the UNFCCC set out for itself, which is to limit climate change to a significantly under 2-degree impact, which is associated with a number of 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. What this is telling you is that the current pledges are not enough to hit these targets according to the science that is accepted by the convention in general. It looks like a flattening for oil and coal and significant growth for gas under what the current pledges are. This is an industry view of what would need to happen to get to the IEA 450 number. It's from BP. And what it shows is that, if you sort of follow the logic from left to right, it shows simply that we need more than just a flattening of the curves for coal and oil. We need steep reductions in the energy intensity of GDP. We need steep reductions in the carbon intensity of the energy supplied to make those outputs. This implies continued growth in gas, a flattening of the higher carbon fossil fuels. In principle, a faster transition all the way to the IEA 450 should be good for a growing gas market. This translates into actual molecules if the world moves in this direction. Where's the World Bank in all of this? Well, of course, we work pretty closely with better than 100 countries on the planet that are developing countries, many of them quite poor. We work across the span, energy and other sectors. In the context of our annual meetings earlier this month, our president laid out the key things that the bank expects to do with our client countries. Critically, the middle bullet there, slow down the growth of coal-fired power plants. We explicitly support the backing out of coal through increased use of gas. We are targeting South and East Asian countries that have very, very large amounts of coal-fired power generation coming in their power development plans in future years. Those are China, Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Philippines, and Vietnam. I think you can add Thailand and Bangladesh and certain other countries out there as countries where a lot of coal generation could come. We call this sort of follow the carbon, go after the areas where the most incremental carbon is going to come and where a combination of energy efficiency, renewables, and natural gas can avoid some of those future carbon emissions. I would note from this that there was an agreement reached in Rwanda called the Kigali, known now as the Kigali Agreement, to take hydrofluorocarbons out of the global emission mix. That's a very significant deal. It's part of what the World Bank's been working on, fitting under some of the other bullets there. That's estimated to take, HFCs are estimated to be a 0.5 degree Celsius contribution to avoiding climate change, so very, very significant. So this all should be good, but Germany, since 2010, I think you can see the very complex chart in the slide decks later, but trust me when I tell you that this picture shows very, very strong growth in renewables since 2010. It also shows modest growth in coal and lignite, and it also shows steeply declining use of gas and power generation. And what this means is that Germany has achieved incredibly high renewables penetration without reducing carbon at all, okay? This isn't made up. It happens in Germany, and it happens in a lot of other places too. We have a lot of money going into renewables, and we have clients searching for the cheapest things to do for the rest of their energy. And it is the case that the cheapest thing to do in a lot of cases is doing coal. This kind of policy incoherence is exactly why there will be undershoots on COP21. This leads to now the LNG component of my presentation. And here's the key theme. We know that the supply is coming. As everybody has said over the last 2 days, we know it's coming. We have a surplus till 2022, 2023, 2021, pick your date. What we don't know is what demand will be. And we heard yesterday, very interestingly, speaker after speaker after speaker talking about two things. Talking about the requirement for price competitiveness and the need for flexibility. Again, flexibility implies infrastructure. It doesn't necessarily imply a massive quantity of molecules. I want you to look at the slide that I ruthlessly stole from my friends at Goldman, in which they characterized the 2020 market as a market of somewhere north of around 300 million tons, a little bit north of that, I think. And they define 80 of that, 80 million tons per year, as price-sensitive demand. And what happens to 80 million tons? Maybe it doesn't get consumed because of relative prices among competing fuels and other factors. The key area here is in at least the Asian markets in which I traffic quite heavily, what happens with LNG versus coal? Now, I'm sure you are all aware that thermal coal prices in Asia in the last 4 or 5 months have risen quite significantly because of policy steps taken in China to keep coal mines open. That has led to a collapse in the premium of LNG over coal, which is often 200%, down to about 50%. And it has contributed to very steep year-on-year increases in Japanese LNG imports, Indian LNG imports, Chinese LNG imports. There is more LNG going into the power sector in August and September because of the greater competitiveness of LNG versus coal. What goes up can come down, and this dynamic will be a feature, I think, going forward when coal is more expensive and LNG doesn't change price as rapidly, let's say. More LNG will be used, and the reverse is also true. When it comes to LNG in competitive markets, and as we heard yesterday, Japan, Korea, Philippines, most of Europe, most of North America, etc., these are worlds in which dispatch of power plants is driven by market considerations, not by political motives. It produces a world in which economically LNG will be dispatched in some countries in the mid-cycle, and I think you can see from, this is a load duration curve from the Luzon market, Where we see LNG being competitive is essentially knocking out the diesel oil component. It is not going to be competitive in backing out pipeline gas or coal. That has produced a situation, at least in the Luzon case, where coal is taking over as the primary source of the energy in that electricity market. The implication, again, is that countries that need gas need the infrastructure. They need the ability to be somewhat flexible in how much gas they use. The economics are strong in the mid-cycle, but the amount of energy that is produced in the mid-cycle, if you look at the chart, megawatts on the vertical, hours on the horizontal, you're therefore looking at quantities of megawatt hours, and you can see that the mid-cycle megawatt hours are 20 or 25% of the total energy. We do a lot of modeling to figure this out, country after country after country. I've put up an unnamed Asian country here, calculations we did recently. This is the most favorable assumptions that we could reasonably make. And what we show is that coal at $60 a ton versus gas at $7 per million BTU, and that includes the cost of receiving, storage, regasification. We show here that coal would be the choice in the base load. Now this is the decision point for what do I build today, coal or gas? And this is about as favorable as it gets for LNG in most East and South Asian markets. If I make the power plant bigger, the coal plant probably gets to be a better deal. If I depart from the base load, given those same assumptions that I used before, this actually shows remarkable competitiveness for gas. You would not find too many cases in too many of the markets that I work in where with a load factor as high as about 64, 65%, LNG would be the choice. That number more typically, with more conservative modeling, would be somewhere between 30 and maybe 55%. Again, it translates into a requirement for gas to be least cost, which needs infrastructure, but it doesn't necessarily add up to a lot of molecules, and it doesn't necessarily mean a huge quantity of fixed and inflexible supply. It implies something else. There are a lot of new markets for LNG, and the numbers that I showed on 500 megawatt power plants, those are around the range of the kinds of anchor customers that are contemplated in many of the potential projects that you see on the FSRU chart here. Now, many of these projects that are listed as potential, we get they won't happen, many of them. But some of them will, and I suspect that those that have a better chance than others will be ones where there is a focus on infrastructure and a focus on flexibility, and that we are not trying to, as I term it, break the market by putting too much inflexibility in terms of the power offtake, in terms of the gas supply, and in terms of other factors. The bank group is a ready, willing, and able financier and supporter of LNG infrastructure development and all the things around that. We will work as one bank, IFC and World Bank working together on policy dialogues, on advice, on strategies, on transaction processes in countries that are seeking to enter the LNG market or seeking to expand a presence in the LNG market. We have active engagements in countries like Myanmar, Vietnam, Philippines, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Tunisia, et cetera, et cetera. Many of the little dots on the perspective map. On the IFC side, we have a large and growing pipeline of deals. There have been 3 closures so far. Those are Pakistan, which is a terminal play, senior debt. Panama, which is integrated gas to power with an FSRU as an interim supply solution, and then an onshore tank. IFC senior debt. Bangladesh, which is a IFC Infraventures equity investment in the project company that includes Accelerate as well. Ongoing exploration of investment possibilities in South Africa and El Salvador and other places. Well, I think the key conclusions for me gets back to something that I've mentioned a few times, which is just that it's important to give countries the ability to access the LNG market, to give sub-markets within those countries the ability to be supplied with gas. It's very difficult to predict exactly how much gas demand there will be, but the ability to import is a key to unlocking these markets. I think that there's great potential for LNG in those markets in some scenarios, but it's the infrastructure which will allow that potential to be realized. And so from the perspective of a seller of LNG, it's almost important to identify those markets that have good infrastructure development strategies that can get the terminals developed before you try and ram 1 million or 2 million tons of LNG down their throats, to coin a phrase. I think also that one of the big implications of Paris with nationally determined contributions, we're going to see more renewables. And we all like to think that renewables complement natural gas and the other way around, but they only do that in the context of good policy. It's possible that policy is not always good, and in those cases, LNG and renewables will compete with each other. I would encourage you all to speak with Nikos Safos, who will speak after me, in case he doesn't mention in his own presentation quantitative research that he did that showed this in European markets. And the one European market where he found that there was complementarity was the one market, the UK, that has a carbon tax. I do think we'll always have Paris. I think the Paris thing is real. I think you can expect uneven policy implementation. I think if it's really uneven, the world moves toward a mandatory framework. I think if the achievement against targets is reasonably good, we may continue for a long time with a voluntary framework. But voluntary is what we have, and voluntary will produce a lot of uncertainty. Thank you very much.